Hi, today we're going to look at using Scottish grown larch for cladding houses and buildings. This is an instructional video for Ashes, that's the Association of Scottish Hardwood Sawmillers, and we're doing it at the Scottish Wood Yard in Fife. Here's a very quick look at how we turn a larch log into larch cladding. All these logs are grown in Scotland, all fairly local to our yard here. We try and keep our road miles down. The logs are all graded to be suitable for cladding so that there's no defects in the timber, no big knots. The larch is quite a dense timber and quite resinous, and it's this resinous property that helps to make it so durable, wonderfully durable timber. We use band saws, which leaves a very fine sawn finish on the timber. Most of our larch doesn't get planed, it just goes out sawn with a sawn finish. And in a moment we'll look at some of the different types of cladding, the more popular types, and how to put these on the wall. Here we have Scottish larch cladding. This is batten on board, and it's put up in a way that you have a 45, this is a 45mm batten over a 150mm board. Now this is a rain screen. It's designed so that it's not keeping water out completely. If any moisture gets behind it, then there is an air gap behind this cladding, a gap at the bottom for it to come out, and a gap at the top for it to vent. So the idea is that you have a ventilation space behind this rain screen, and any moisture that gets behind it vents off. That's essential. We have batten on board. Below the batten on board we have horizontal cladding. Now, horizontal cladding is profiled boards. It might be shiplap, it might be V-groove. This is tongue and groove V-groove. Normally people go for one or the other. We quite like the mixture, so we've got both here. Here we have board on board. The two most common and most popular types for putting cladding onto a wall vertically is in Scotland. It's batten on board, which we've just looked at, and board on board. This is board on board. Again, we have the airspace behind. We have the first layer of 150mm 6-inch boards against the wall, or against the support battens, and then a 100mm gap in between each first layer of boards, and then another 6-inch or 150mm board spanning that gap with a 25mm overlap on either side. So again, this is a rain screen. It's only supporting its own weight. There's nothing structural here. This has been on the wall for about 2 years. It's begun to weather. It's begun to lose its golden colour, and it's beginning to go that weathered grey colour. Now, larch will last for a number of decades if it's put up properly and if the detail is correct. And we'll look at some larch cladding in a little while that's been on the wall for over 20 years. But it's good for a good few decades. Just while I'm here, you can see simple detail around the windows. Another good thing about larch cladding, it's a simple thing to put up. You don't need a lot of experience in woodworking skills to do that. You can do it, most people can do it themselves. And you can nail it or you can screw it. This has been nailed with a nail gun. A little bit of staining from the nail heads, but that staining will quickly disappear as the timber weathers. Again, we have detail here. You've got angles at the top of the boards here to make sure any water coming down will just run away from the wall. You don't want water to sit on end grain, so any end grain here is angled to shed the water. Again, a gap at the bottom to allow any moisture that does get behind the wall to just drop out the bottom here. And we also have a gap at the top for ventilation. Right, so earlier I was telling you that larch should last for a number of decades. This larch has been on the wall for 25 years. There is no sign of decay. It's in as good nick as when it went up, and it's probably good for another 25, 50, 75 years. We have eaves so that the rainwater doesn't go immediately onto the wall unless it's driven by wind, which is okay, so it's not wet usually when it's raining. We have a gap at the bottom so that any splashes doesn't splash directly onto the timber, so it stays dry at the bottom. The timber has weathered to a silvery grey. Now this is the colour that all timber will weather to, and it takes a few years for this to happen, and it's very difficult to stop that. Some people like to try and stain it or apply paint. Really the only way you can stop timber staining is by painting it or by applying some kind of stain. Otherwise you have to cope with it. You'll see there are knots. It's not that larch is a knotty timber, you can't avoid the knots. Sometimes knots will fall out. For example here there's a small knot that's fallen out there, and water may get behind the cladding. But we have good ventilation here. There's a ventilation strip there, so any moisture behind the cladding can vent out the top, or drip or vent out of the bottom. So you've got this constant flow of air that keeps the wall dry behind the cladding. That's where your air gap is essential. So I said earlier at Scottish Wood we quite like this mixture of vertical and horizontal. It's a little bit more complicated to put up, but it looks quite good and it breaks up a wall. You can see here the detail of the shiplap. This is an overlap. Each join overlaps the one behind, so any water running down there is always running off and away from the wall. You see the air gap behind, about 25 mil, and we have planed these boards. Profile boards, shiplap is always planed. Most cladding that we sell that's vertical is rough sawn, like this board here. That's a rough sawn board, fine sawn board, not planed. The majority of boards that we sell for cladding is rough sawn. It's really personal choice. This is a 22 mil by 150 mil cladding board, and important with cladding that you put the heart face, that's the face nearest the centre of the log, to the outside. And you can see that if you look at the end grain. So you can see the curve of the tree rings, and you can see this face here is the face nearest the centre. And the reason for doing that is because if the board wants to cup, if it wants to take on a curve, then if you've put a nail or a screw through the centre of that board, it can't curve. It always curves in the opposite direction to the tree ring. So this board will curve in this direction. I'll draw on it to make it clearer. This board will want to curve in this direction. But if you've put a central screw through there, then it can't, because these corners are tight against the wall, so it won't be able to curve. If you put it the other way around, and you put your central screw through, then these two corners can peel up away from the wall. So that's why it's always important. This is the wall here. You can read my terrible writing. It's always important for the heart face to go on the outside, and the face nearest the outside of the log to go on the inside against the wall. We'll clad this wall, and we'll carry on probably doing it vertical all the way to the floor. That's why we've stopped here. So what we need to do here is we need to put a spacer against the wall, maybe 25 mil wide by 10 mil, 12 mil thick. That's purely a spacer. And then on top of that spacer we put a horizontal support batten. And the horizontal support batten is what you screw or nail your cladding boards to. And that support batten we tend to use about 30 mil by 60 mil. So 30 mil thick, 60 mil deep, and that is what we then nail or screw the boards to. The reason for the spacer is so that if any moisture gets behind, then it can run down and it won't get caught on the support battens. If you screw the support battens against the wall, then the moisture will get caught in them and won't run away. We always want the water to run away. So you put your spacer down, then your horizontal support battens, and then your cladding boards. You leave a gap at the bottom, gap at the top, and the wall is well ventilated, and any moisture should just vent off. For horizontal cladding, you don't need the spacers. You can simply put your support battens. They can be, again, quite beefy, 25 by 50, 30 by 60, and you simply screw your horizontal boards to those vertical battens. Any moisture can run down unimpeded. Bob's your uncle. Well vented. Right, so we were looking at vertical cladding, and I also showed you some horizontal cladding, some shiplap cladding. Now we have another type of horizontal cladding, which is called open jointed cladding. These boards are not touching each other. There's no overlap, there's no tongue and groove, there's purely a gap between each board. The edges of the boards are profiled to shed the water off each board and onto the one below, so the water will never get behind. If you do get moisture behind, then we have plenty of ventilation. There's gaps between each board, about 10 mil. And so any moisture behind there will vent off and it will remain dry. Again, this timber is weathered. It's been on the wall for about 15 years. Very difficult to avoid that unless you decide you want to paint the timber or to put wood stain onto it. But if you do that, you have the maintenance issues. You have to maintain the painting, and whereas this one is maintenance free, very low cost, maintenance free, and will be here for decades. The screws used here were galvanized screws, and I was talking about galvanized before, and so there would have been some staining when it was fresh timber, and you can see how that staining has completely disappeared. Here we have stainless steel screws, 15 years on, still silver. Here also stainless steel, so it shows the difference between galvanized and stainless steel. Stainless steel is probably the better option on the whole. They're not as strong as as standard screws, but they're not bad. Again, more open jointed cladding. You can see the builder paper behind there. Basically what we have here is a support batten running vertically, another support batten running vertically, and a gap of about 25-30 mil, and then that's the space behind the cladding boards, and then the cladding boards on top. So it's purely a rain screen, plenty of ventilation, showing the detail around the window, quite simple, just a cover strip. Any end grain like this should be angled so water just sheds off it. Basically you're wanting water to move away from the wood. This is a south facing wall, so it will have weathered to this weathered colour fairly quickly, maybe 2 or 3 summers. On a north facing wall it might take maybe 5 or 10 summers. And basically it's the UV of the sunlight mixed with the water. And that along with lignin in the timber feeds something called stain fungi. And it's stain fungi that makes the timber go grey. It needs water and it needs ultraviolet. For example, if we look up to the top here, the soffit boards at the top and the overhang, those are still golden coloured. And the reason for that is that it doesn't get water. So the stain fungi gets some sunlight but no water. So no stain fungi up there, the timber is still a golden colour. Here's typical corner detail for horizontal cladding. Same for whether it's open jointed or shiplap. You simply end the boards before the corner and then you have a slightly proud, this is about 60 mil square running vertically, and then the gap, the usual gaps. Always good to keep gaps rather than having timber joining or touching. You should never have timber touching on the end grain, because then by osmosis you get water held in the gap and it gets into the end grain of the timber. Now, one thing about using durable timber rather than treated timber, and this is something a lot of people don't appreciate, is that when you treat non-durable timber, you're basically providing a protective envelope. You pressure treat it and the timber absorbs the treatment, and that provides a protective envelope around the outside of the timber that maybe penetrates only a few millimeters. Now as soon as you cut a piece off of that timber or you drill a hole through it, you're breaking through that protective envelope. And unless you then retreat it, or paint it, or dip it, then that timber is no longer protected by its preservation, by its preservative treatment. With naturally durable timber, you can cut it where you like, you can drill it where you like, do whatever you want, and the timber is still durable. You're not compromising its durability. And that's one of the great benefits of using naturally durable timber over treated timber. And finally, what we haven't spoken about is waney edge or natural edge cladding. Here's a nice example, natural edge cladding, starting at the bottom, one board, then the next board overlaps the one below, and the next overlaps that, and so on, with maybe a 25 or 38 mil overlap. Very simple. We are including in here the sapwood. Now, when we're talking about durable heartwood larch, we're talking about the heartwood of the timber and not the sapwood. We remove the sapwood in the sawmill because the sapwood is non-durable. So one of the disadvantages of waney edge cladding is that you have to incorporate the sapwood. So eventually, after 10, 20 years, the sapwood will be, especially if it's exposed to a lot of wet, the sapwood will begin to fail on the edges of the board. So it won't last as long as square-edged larch cladding boards. But it looks very attractive, looks bondy, very easy features. Here's simply a cover plate around a window, around a door, another cover plate here. You put your vertical support patterns against the wall. I think in this case we used 25 mil by 50 mil, and you simply nail onto those vertical support patterns. Well, I hope that was helpful. Thank you for being here. If you want more information, just go to the Ashes website, that's ashes.co.uk. You will also find there a list of members who can give you individual attention and their whereabouts in Scotland. So thank you for being here. I hope it's been useful. Happy cladding.